That's the wrong one. Sorry, guys. If you're watching this right now, this isn't supposed to be how we're launching, but we're going to do it improv here. So here we go. What's up, and welcome back to Cryptographics. It's not supposed to be how we're launching, but we were just talking about, we're both a little rusty at streaming, and point in case, here we are. Welcome on this fine Tuesday morning, or maybe it's Wednesday for you, wherever you are. But thank you for being here. If you've noticed, I've got the, happens to be the founder of both TITANX and Hyper here with me, Jake Sharp. And we're going to go in today. We're going to discover what is Hyper. We're going to talk about the hard questions, the easy questions. We're going to navigate through everything. And I really want you guys, the viewer, or if you're in the chat, to really engage with this too. What I want to do is I want to have the questions that I'll have already written down, and we're going to go through Hyper and everything. And then near the end, as we really get into like the deeper stuff, that's when I really want to bring you guys forward with the questions. And anything that hasn't already been answered, I am going to bring up then. So save your questions for now. And if I do see any good ones, I will star them and keep them in the background, but save them for the end so I can pay attention to our conversation and give you guys the best experience possible. And then at the end, I'll bring up your questions and we can just focus on that. So without further ado, though, Jake, thank you for being here, man. It's great to have you back.
Likewise, rusty as hell because it's been 2 months. So we were both like, wait, how do the buttons work?
Yep.
But I'm excited, man. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of fun around Hyper and TITANX. The ecosystem has never been healthier if you know where to look. So I guess we'll go over all that stuff. We'll ask all the hard questions. And hopefully people have a lot clearer of a view because I'm not worried at all. Zero.
And I guess that's a really great sign. If you're not worried at all, I mean, there's two fronts there. One is you probably have to say that, but two, you also don't have to, and you could be brutally honest, and you could be actually stoked for what's coming out. And on that note, let's get right into Hyper. So as a quick overview for people who are just joining in and don't really know what's going on here, obviously Jake built TITANX, inflationary system, fair launch system. It's quite a cool thing that hasn't really been built before. And Hyper is basically this next layer that is going to not solve things, but take potentially TITANX to another level. How does it work? Why did you build Hyper? And yeah, let's start with like the 10,000 foot view on Hyper, and I'll bring up the mining page so people can see the DApp here. You guys are probably going to be very familiar with it. If you're just hearing about Hyper now and you know about TITANX, then let's start here.
Yep. So there's some magic I won't talk about, but Hyper is epic. So basically what Hyper is, a lot of people think Hyper is a step away from TITANX, which is not the case at all. When people start miners on Hyper, there's a lot that changes in the backend of what happens inside of Hyper to make sure that the miner ROIs are sustainable for the long term. Because in TITANX, we had high TITANX, which dragged the price lower than it actually needed to go, but also brought a crap ton of community adoption with it. So it's kind of a give or take. But in the long term, TITANX is designed to be a fair launch store of value, and Hyper is supposed to be the hyper compounding system built on top of the store of value. Now, here's the interesting part. Because you use Ethereum to mine Hyper, Hyper gets its value from TITANX. So as TITANX goes up, Hyper goes up. But use Ethereum to mine. So what is easier to move up a 3x, Ethereum or TITANX? TITANX, obviously, because it's only a $70 million market cap at this point with the supply coming out and stuff. Which means that if TITANX is a 3x, Hyper by default is a 3x, but you paid Ethereum. You didn't pay TITANX, which means that your ROI goes up 3x. So if you have a 30x on Hyper and TITANX goes up a 3x, that's a 90x. So this is basically a leverage mining system on an easily movable asset, which is TITANX. Now, TITANX is in a very interesting position where we'll go into how to use Hyper, because I like saying TITANX is a fair launch store of value and that people build upon. Hyper is also built on top of TITANX. 100%, like it's 100% linked. Now, Hyper is a tool. So the way I would recommend using Hyper, not financial advice, zero research, we're lucky if this works, but it's a compounding system. Meaning that you start miners on Hyper, you take those miners, you sell them on the market, you start more miners. As you do that, this is a flywheel system on top of TITANX, because what happens with the Ethereum, close to 100%, 97% of it, buys TITANX on market, then uses 100% of that TITANX to buy Hyper on market. Now, there's some little nuance in there with the vortex that triggers every 98 days. But in theory, 100% of the TITANX buys Hyper. So you get a double buy effect. And you get liquidity bonding between TITANX and Hyper. Now, as people start miners on Hyper, all of it buys TITANX. And as TITANX becomes more valuable, Hyper becomes more valuable. And it outpaces Ethereum's appreciation. So Hyper is basically a way to increase your position into TITANX or increase your position into Ethereum. And it's a system that you have to compound it. So I made this tweet, and Hyper is designed for compounding. TITANX is designed for store of value, because there's a lot of tweaks that we made at Hyper to make it a compounding system. So here's the idea. Compounding is a lot more efficient way of getting to your goals in crypto. So what a lot of people try to do is they try to buy something with a low market cap and hope and pray it does 100x before it rug pulls, which usually ends up rug pulling, or you end up buying the top. Because here's also another thing. A lot of people like promoting 100x, but the fact of you buying 100x is practically zero. Because you hear about the 100x after it's done a 30x. So if it goes from 30x to 100x, you've only made a 3x. You didn't make a 70x, you made a 3x. Because if you buy at $1 and it goes to $100, but you bought at 30 to 100 is only a 3x, even though it's a 70x for the Yuri people. So a lot of people have this false expectation when it comes to crypto about like hitting 100x's, etc. That doesn't exist. You get shilled at once it's at a local top. So your actual gains is a 2x, which you can easily get on Hyper miners or even TITANX miners in the beginning. Now, the interesting thing is, I put this in this tweet. So getting 100x is close to non-existent, unless you're the creator of the thing, basically. And you were the first one to buy in the liquidity pool. Getting 3-5x is so much easier. Like the amount of, in the beginning, when people started TITANX miners, the people that did miners from, I think it was day 12 to day 67-ish, because when the price went with TITANX, they got like 12x's on their miners. So if they took that 12x and they went longer with their miners, made a 3x, now they made 12x times 3x, which is a 36x in a couple months, because they're compounding. Now, Hyper is designed to be compounded, so the miner ROI will stay higher for longer, and there's some magic happening in the backend that we obviously can't talk about, but it's pretty epic. And to get to your goals in crypto, compounding is by far the most efficient and reliable way to get there, because 3-5x is relatively simple, as long as your time frame is like a 6-month period. So if you put $1,000 in, for example, to show the power of compounding, put $1,000 in, times 5 is 5,000, times 5 is 25,000, times 5 is 125,000. That's 125x on initial. So I'm a big believer in compounding systems, and TITANX and Hyper are extremely, extremely giving systems, because what usually happens is, so people start miners in TITANX. 97% of that goes back into the protocol and 3% no expectations. That is an extremely giving system, because what usually happens is people do these pre-sales or sacrifices or ICOs. And guess what? You put your money in, 100% of it goes to the founder and none of it comes back to you. So there's 100% tax on all these pre-sales and stuff. So I like the idea. I've always looked at crypto from a space of building blocks, and I've become obsessed with this idea of liquidity bonding and leverage plays, which is where the idea for TITANX came, and then after that, which is where the idea for Hyper came. So all the build on TITANX ecosystem projects are basically leverage plays on TITANX, which only becomes harder and more expensive to create every single day. And at this point, we're basically capped supply. There's no supply coming out in the future because miner ROI is negative. So it is a store of value. Supply just has to come out. And we're burning a crap ton every day. So if you look at all of this ecosystem is sick. We have more developers than some L1s. It's got another crazy thing to think about.
Mhm.
So I went off on a tangent there. Maybe you can hook onto something or whatever. But
Oh, for sure. Well, dude, you said a lot there. So, I mean, I guess to start with Hyper real quick, I want to make sure that everyone who's watching fully gets it. So let's just do like a quick summary here of the parts of Hyper, because for just to clarify too. So we talked about Hyper for a moment. We talked about the leverage side of things on ETH and the leverage on Titan. in terms of what hyper is. We talked about the compounding, which I want to go over, and we talked about like the idea of TITANX being, you know, a store of value as well. And those 4 things alone, man, we could have a whole. We're going to go off on that. I have a ton of questions here. Well, I want to start on hyper to just make sure everyone's up to speed before we start getting into the super deep stuff here. So let's stay with the hyper app right now. And of course, so this looks very similar to TITANX. Of course, you know, obviously, you know, the gradient in the background seems to be the main thing that I'm noticing, other than just like the specifics of the numbers and everything, and the minor lengths. That's different. So really, walk us through just the basics of hyper. We'll just go through like each page here, and we'll just talk about a brief overview of. We don't have to get into necessarily every single aspect of it, but whatever you want to go over to give the viewer the proper idea, so that when we get into these later topics, they're still following us and they're not wishing we had gone through this to understand why we're talking about what we're talking about.
Okay, so from a high level, the features of hyper, the things that you do to interact as a user, is you can start miners. Now, I'm a big fan of the mining way of token distribution, because it gives everybody a fair shot to get in at the same cost basis and build a community where everybody got in at the same point, but doing it without raising money from the general public, which is nice for security. So people interact with code. They decide how long they want to go out. The longer they want to go out, the more coins they get. And the more power kind of dictates how much you want to pay. Now, if you do 10,000 power or 100 power, it just determines how much Ethereum it costs, but your cost per hyper stays the same. So this is just to save on gas fees. If you just want, instead of doing 10 100 power miners, you do 1,000 power miner. And that way you only have to pay the gas fee once to start it and once to end it, instead of 10 times to start it and 10 times to end it. So the power feature is there for that. Now,
and
the longer
one thing
that
I'll
you
say
go,
is I love that power feature. Like, I think that's so cool to be able to choose literally up to 100 miners in a single miner. I don't know if anyone else has done this yet, but the gas fees are extremely cheap in comparison to the TITANX mining system. So I'm so appreciative of that. Like, for one, I think that was an awesome change, and I'm very happy that definitely better late than never with that one, you know, especially as this is maybe a system that gets used a lot more for mining than TITANX in the coming months. I think that was a huge change. So not to derail us, but yeah, for one, awesome. I love that.
Yeah, for sure, because Ethereum gas fees are going to get expensive in the run. But the thing is, even if Ethereum gas fees go through the roof, people still trade on the chain because there's profit to be made. If you make 10 grand and you pay 300 in gas fees, who cares?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that. It's the pay to play high end mall, basically. Now, the longer out you go, the more coins you get, and the power dictates how much they cost. So you, with your own private keys, interacting with a smart contract, create your own supply. You're not getting it from a central authority. You're not getting it from another person. You don't have to buy it from an exchange at a premium. You can actually mine your own coins with a predictable cost basis. And the longer out you go, the less they cost, because you're willing to put in more time in the protocol. So you're investing time and you're investing Ethereum. Now, the best way to kind of play Hyper is designed to be a compounding protocol. So let's say you start a 10-day miner. You make, hypothetical, not financial advice, you make a 3x. You take that 3x, you sell it back into Ethereum. As you do that, yes, you are dumping down the price of TITANX, but you take that Ethereum back into the protocol. All of that Ethereum now goes and buys TITANX on market, which means that it left the hands of the people that were going to sell anyway, and now it goes into a smart contract that will never sell it. And it burns a percentage of it. So I made this tweet on the whole TITANX ecosystem. I would love for almost all the TITANX supply to be held by smart contracts instead of people, because smart contracts are predictable and people are extremely irrational. So, for example, Hyper launched and people started selling TITANX like crazy because they didn't understand the system. And then I saw there was like this divide happening in the community where half of the people hated it. They're like, oh, this is just another copy of TITANX, is completely delinked, etc., etc. And then the other half is like, this is genius. This is as linked as you can get it. So there's a big reason we did Ethereum instead of liquid TITANX, which we might get into later.
Yeah, and just for the viewers watching, we are definitely going to get into that for sure. I'm not skipping anything. I want to make sure that all your questions, because I know it's one of the big ones I've been seeing on Twitter. We're definitely getting into that. So we'll pause there though. Hold that thought. And so I hear you. So you obviously, yeah, chose ETH to integrally link it together. Please, sorry, continue.
Yep. Now, there's also an option to stake. Now, staking is not something you just randomly do for 30 days. It's basically going to be event-based staking. So every 98 days and every 369 days, there's a staking event, a staking payout event, which a percentage of the hyper, 20% of the hyper that is bought with TITANX on market, goes into staking. So you get bought on market hyper and not inflation hyper. So you get the hyper that is bought on the market via the protocol. So it doesn't come from inflation. Now, what will happen here is this is going to be a cycle-based event. Like every 98 days, there's probably going to be arbitrages there where people can take maybe even 100 billion hyper, stake it, and get 120 billion hyper back because nobody staked. So this is kind of like a one-day event. A lot of people are going to buy on market for that because the arbitrage exists. It's like a quick way to do it, which takes supply off of DEX. And we did it this way because we wanted to make sure that all the TITANX bought hyper on market instead of the TITANX being in staking payouts because it has a bigger effect on the miner other way. Right. And we did want to get rid of staking. So yeah, you can mine, you can stake. Now, the buy and burn is sick. All the Ethereum that comes in buys TITANX on market. As you can see with this button. 20% of the TITANX that is bought gets burned. The remaining 80% buys hyper on market. And the 80% of that gets burned, 20% gets given to staking payouts. So there's a massive hyper deflationary effect to hyper. The hyper doesn't get as harder to, doesn't get as more expensive and more scarce to create in the future. So for example, on TITANX, it was 0.35%. You get 0.35% less a day. You pay more Ethereum. Hyper is different because we want it to be a compounding system that lasts for a long period of time. And people can use it as a tool to increase their TITANX position or to increase their Ethereum position, depending on what they see perform better in the future. Now, hyper is different. The supply gets a little bit harder to create every day, 0.08%, and the cost in Ethereum doesn't move up, which means that it's a lot easier for the miner ROI to stay higher and people to use it as a compounding tool to increase their positions.
Oh, that's actually one thing that I had missed. So that's actually really important to understand here, guys. That like TITANX, if you're familiar with TITANX, the ETH cost goes up by 0.08% per day, right? In TITANX?
Yes. Yep.
Right. So if that's not happening, you don't have an extra difficulty measure coming in. So what's actually interesting to think about there, which we might get into later, is that it might actually become easier in ETH terms, not total cost basis in terms of the tokens going down, but it actually might become easier eventually than where it is now. Maybe, I mean, we're on the precipice of a bull run here, so probably not for a little while, but you never know, right? Maybe, but what's possible is the ETH costs actually come down if the price of Ethereum comes down. And that's interesting to think about because with TITANX, that's not possible. Really. I mean, it is, relatively, but it's more difficult because the cost is constantly going up. So I can just appreciate that feature. That's really interesting. And even that alone, I mean, you could think a lot about and how it's going to affect. So for the compounding game, I think that's a really cool idea, actually.
Now, here's another interesting thing. Go to more and stats. So if you look at the hyper distribution, it's very interesting. It looks different than TITANX. So in hyper, you have liquid, staked, payouts, penalties, user burn, buy and burn, NLP fees burn.
Mm-hmm.
Liquid is very low, which is kind of interesting to see. So liquid on TITANX will be lower because on TITANX, on hyper, you have an early miner end feature, which didn't exist in Titan, which we can go over. There are situations where it actually makes sense because if you look on penalties, that 4 billion hyper that was burned, roughly 180,000 words, came from early miner ending. The penalties.
This one, where is it here? Wait, which one? The penalties. Oh, this one. Okay, yeah. Crazy, 4 billion burned. That's a significant amount of hyper so far burned.
Yeah, exactly. Because what people are doing is after 3 days, it becomes available. So if you start a miner on day 4, it will become available on day 7. Start a miner on day 100, it will become available at day 103. So 3 days after miner start, you'll see the claim early button activate. That allows you to claim early, but you get a penalty. The penalty is 50% minimum. So let's say you have a miner, you get to progress 10%. That means if you early end, you pay a 90% penalty because you only served 10%. But if you go like your miner is 70% matured, you hit the 50% minimum. Instead of 30% penalty, you hit 50%. So there's a 50% minimum penalty for early ending. And you pay half of the Ethereum it costs to start. So if it costs 0.2 Ethereum to start, you pay a 0.1 Ethereum end fee. Now, this end fee goes the exact same way it does when people start a miner. goes to buy TITANX on market, goes to buy Hyper on market. So now we have a scenario where it actually sometimes makes sense for quicker compounding to early end it, because people are like making 50% ROI and they just compound faster doing it that way, which makes sense for some people. It's like an advanced user function, but people are using it, which removes future supply because it's not mintable and adds more Ethereum to the protocol, which creates a scenario where the buy pressure is actually more than the supply coming out. This is extremely advanced game theory, but the early miner in this epic.
That actually is a very interesting concept. You know, the early claim that takes so much supply off the market so quickly, and I think that's definitely something I wasn't seeing coming. You know, the early end. I think that's very interesting. With the where was it here? So just to clarify too, guys, if you haven't seen this before, if you are familiar with the miners though, it'll be just down here. So if you come to the mining page on Hyper, go to active miners, and then you're going to see over here on the right-hand side, you're going to see early end and claim as the columns here. It'll be right here under this early end period, or under this early end column, and it'll highlight in blue when it's available after 3 days.
Well, purple. The color in Hyper is purple.
Oh, is it purple?
So, you know,
okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Right.
So you know the meme back in TITANX, like, oh, if you can click a blue button, you're good to go. Well, Hyper is if you can click a purple button, you're good to go.
I like that. Nice. Yeah, purple button, blue button. I like that. Yeah, nice. Okay, so I like that so far. And the one thing that I'm noticing we haven't really talked about, because I feel like, you know, for the most part, it's fairly easy to understand. And I want to come back to staking eventually. But let's talk about, we've got the buy TITANX contract, which buys TITANX. We've got the Hyper buy and burn, which goes and then buys up Hyper with that, with the TITANX that is bought by TITANX. And then you also have this thing called the vortex. And there's a lot of, I would say, maybe you could say confusion too, speculation, uncertainty about what the vortex is. Can you talk about what this is and why you developed it?
Yep. So let's start at the basics. One of the biggest FUD items in TITANX is what happens on day 280 when a bunch of supply comes out. What if you had a vortex on TITANX that triggered on day 300? That had a bunch of saved up Ethereum to buy it. So the max miner length on Hyper is day 88. Max miner length on TITANX is day 280. Now, once day 88 hit, there's probably a bunch of people that started max miners at the launch, similar to TITANX. We don't have to do analytics yet. So on day 88, it will probably dump and then be bought back up with the buy and burn. Now, what if you had a buy and burn saved up for after day 88? That would take care of that max FUD event that was saved up from the start. That's basically the vortex. So the vortex stays 10% of TITANX bought on market and 8% of the Ethereum used to start miners. This builds up until day 98. Now, there's nuance to it, because we like game theory here. Is the TITANX, after day 98, the TITANX gets put into the Hyper buy and burn, and then it buys and burns Hyper. So you have a saved up stash for after max cycle ends, which makes it more enticing for people to keep compounding even after we've hit day 88, which is going to be a big supply come out, it will recover, and then the game continues. But the Ethereum will not trigger on day 98. The Ethereum will trigger for the first time on day 196. Now, why day 196? And then it will do every 98 days after that.
And can I clarify one thing on that too? Is it day 196 of TITANX or 196 of Hyper?
Hyper.
It's day 196 of Hyper.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Now, here's why. Is the big FUD event in Hyper is day 280. So day 196, which is the second 98-day cycle, is September 19th, which just so happens to be the last day practically any TITANX supply comes out.
Interesting. Okay, so that's not playing to the to August. It's playing to when the supply is no longer really coming out in September. Interesting.
Correct.
Interesting. And
so we have this buy and burn saving up for when all the supply is in existence, pretty much.
Right. So, interesting. I have questions that I don't want to ask yet because I don't want us to go too far ahead too quickly. But let's talk about how this works. So at the moment, I don't see a purple button. I don't see anything going on here in terms of, you know, a interval or a an amount that will be able to be called? How does this work? How does this all get called for both the ETH and the TITANX front?
So the Ethereum that you see and the TITANX that you see is stuck inside of the smart contract, inside of a vault. And once day 98 hits, so the first day 98 will only be TITANX. Then day 196 is TITANX and Ethereum. And then after that, it's TITANX and Ethereum. Like, it's only for the first cycle that the Ethereum gets skipped. But when people trigger the payout cycle, the 98-day payout cycle, the vortex gets triggered with it. And then the Ethereum and the TITANX get sent to the buy and burn smart contracts to refill them, and then they get used. So it's not like one big buy at the same time, because one, slippage would be too high. Two, it would be one big green candle and then one big red candle that would all be for nothing. So it will just inject back into the buy and burns, and then it will be used at the interval that the buy and burns are set at.
Gotcha. Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, this isn't like this. This is the furthest thing from a war chest that's just going to be dumped onto the market. It's basically a timed smart contract that is going to just toss what it has built up within the vortex into the buy TITANX. And I assume this is correct if I'm wrong here. I assume this is to protect. Let's say for some reason the balances are getting drained here. This protects that scenario from still being able to function with a war chest of both ETH and TITANX in case for some reason there's not enough, or I mean, that's probably not going to happen, but even if it did happen, I would assume it's just to protect the funds, right? So that way this war chest builds up on its own and then can be specifically catered to the situation that we're in come September. Is that right?
Correct. So in September, all of the TITANX supply is in existence. So when the buy and burn, the vortex from Hyper starts triggering, there's almost no TITANX in existence. Built on TITANX protocol have burned a bunch. The TITANX buy and burn has burned a bunch. So maybe, hypothetically, we could moon at that point, and as we moon, we track Hyper up with it, which makes miner ROI even better. Because if TITANX is a 3x, Hyper by default is a 3x, because it's its only liquidity pair. So there's like this whole... It's a lot of game theory. But if there's one thing we're good at, it's game theory. So the vortex is awesome. I like it a lot. Hopefully people start to understand it.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot more sense, now that you've explained it in terms of, the why behind it and the specifics of the timing gives a lot more clarity around it. And I mean, I'm looking at the chat here and I'm not seeing too many questions coming out surrounding. I know there's obviously the YouTube delay to the stream delay, but I haven't seen anyone really asking any questions so far about the vortex, other than maybe one in the beginning. But before we keep going here, Mo, my man, thank you. I appreciate you. Thanks for the $20. Mo says, Hyper is a game theory monster. Ignore the FUD. Thank you, man. I appreciate that. So really, I think when it comes, if we go back to Hyper for a second here, so I think the main, and I guess there's one last piece that we could talk about here too, before we start getting into a little bit more the deeper end of the question realm here, is just like TITANX, there's a calculator. So if you want to come in and see your mining, I mean, it does on the mining page as well, but you can come in here on this calculator under tools on the top, and you'll be able to either check your mining, or you'll be able to even see how much you'll get from staking. And you can type in a billion or a million or whatever you want here, and it's going to show you what your ROI is going to be, your Hyper value, and what your ROI is going to be from the 98-day and the 369-day payout as well. So before we move on, is there anything else in terms of the overview of Hyper here that you want to bring up and clarify before we move on to the deeper stuff?
Basics? No. I'm excited for the deeper stuff.
Sweet. Okay. Well, let's do it. Okay. I'm going to pull down this one here, and now it's just you and I. All right, let's do this. So let's start with the big question. Okay. Now, why was the decision to use ETH made instead of burning liquid TITANX? Now, you had a lot of people that were buying and or holding TITANX to be able to participate in Hyper, only to see the price dump on Hyper launch and their value potentially tank. And maybe they did want to get into Hyper, but their value went down. So why did this happen? I guess it didn't really happen covert. There was a tweet that came out slightly before Hyper. But I guess clarification on why it wasn't clear that ETH would be used further down the road, and why was there a delay in letting that information out?
Yep. So I like the book The Art of War. So in The Art of War, you never really make your plans known, so bad actors can't position themselves for something they know that's going to happen in the future. I knew Hyper was going to be extremely net positive, or if you scale over a month, it's extremely net positive. Like it's short term, people get emotional, but long term, it's epic. So the reason we use Ethereum, let's get into that. So the reason we use Ethereum is if you go to app.titanx.win to the stats page. So a little bit of context. TITANX, if you look at actual cost of Ethereum going in, I think roughly 100 million worth of Ethereum, if you look at the actual, like when the miners got started and not the Ethereum appreciation, roughly $100 million of Ethereum went into mining TITANX. That's 100 million. We didn't, all I had was my name and a website. There was no brand recognition. There was no proof of concept. There was no community. There was nothing, just me. And I guess people like me because of my streams and kind of hearing my thoughts and stuff like that. So there was no brand recognition. Now we have brand recognition. People know TITANX. TITANX has been on a top 10 in Ethereum for like almost 5 months straight. Top 10 killer app on Ethereum. Volumes are through the roof. So people know we can build cool stuff. So now Hyper in theory could be bigger than TITANX because of that alone. Now, if it's bigger than TITANX, if you look on the stats page of TITANX, there's roughly 23 trillion liquid now, which is $11 million. Now, let's assume, because it's impossible to get 100% of that 23 trillion into Hyper because there's apathetic people that just hold it and they forget about it for a couple of years, which works. So maybe at most we could get 50% of that, which is $5 million worth of adoption into Hyper. So we would be capped by the burning of our protocol when it comes to adoption. Because only a certain number of people will get in, and a lot of people would be will feel left out because they weren't mining TITANX in the beginning. So we would cap Hyper adoption at 5 million. We've already passed that in 4 days. So by using Ethereum as the adoption mechanism into Hyper, we pass the adoption barriers with the liquid TITANX being so little when it comes to market cap size. So we needed to use Ethereum because I knew Hyper was going to be bigger than TITANX because of all the brand recognition, reputation, and trust we've built up over since TITANX's life. So Hyper needed an uncapped adoption mechanism, which Ethereum fixes. And then all the Ethereum buys TITANX in the back end. So users don't actually know, but this is amazing for Hyper and TITANX.
Right. And the one question I have on that front, you said Hyper could be bigger than TITANX. Can you explain why you made that comment there? Because that's an interesting, that's a pretty big comment. Like Hyper could be bigger than TITANX. Can you explain that?
Because in theory, it's better because it's an easily movable asset that it's linked to. So for example, on TITANX, for Ethereum to do a 3x, it's extremely hard. Like it goes from like whatever, $500 billion to $1.5 trillion. That will take a while, probably a full bull market. Getting TITANX from 10 million to 30 million is very easy. Very easy. And people just get the shit together. So that is a lot easier to move. So if TITANX goes up at 3x, Hyper by default goes up at 3x. So all the miner ROIs go up at 3x as well, which brings in more adoption, which buys TITANX, which pushes up the price, which brings more adoption. So it's a turbo flywheel built on top of the flywheel that is TITANX. So in theory, this could adopt way more people than Hyper because the miner ROIs are way more sustainable and people know and are educated now when it comes to compounding. So Hyper could get bigger than TITANX relatively easily.
I mean, that's a good thing for TITANX. If Hyper gets huge, I mean, that's interesting. And I guess the one question I have on that front too, let me pull up hopefully a couple charts here. And I wanted to ask you about that as well, the bonding as well here. Let me go to, which one am I at here? Share this tab. So if we look at TITANX, just literally the last day, like, I mean, I know I'm not bringing this up to be like, oh, look how much we're going down. I'm just observing this candle here, just for the purposes of this question here, and clarification for everyone too. So this candle here, we measure about 15% down, right, over the past 24 hours. If we go over to Hyper and we come over here and we go to the daily chart, we don't have a candle here that is pulling Hyper down. So I'm curious, and we even had some times where, oh, there we go. We're a little further down there. It just updated. Boom.
Yep.
So it's
I
come
mean,
down a little bit.
that is easy to explain. So the liquidity bonding, because it's a ratio against TITANX. If you look at hyper TITANX on the right, you see price 96 TITANX per one hyper.
Mm-hmm.
So when the protocol buys hyper with TITANX, it pushes up that ratio. So even if TITANX goes down 5%, but hyper goes up 10% on the ratio, it's still a 5% increase on hyper value.
Right.
Yep. Now, another thing people don't get. So I've heard a lot of from uneducated people. So the way liquidity pools work, and this is a very advanced crypto topic, is people think the buy and burn sells TITANX on market to buy hyper, and it impacts the price. That's not the case at all. So the way liquidity pools work is the way TITANX gets its price is from the TITANX wrapped Ethereum pool. So if there's no selling into wrapped Ethereum, the TITANX price does not move, because every liquidity pool, the way it gets its price is between the ratio of two things. So if the TITANX buys hyper, it changes the ratio in that pool. It doesn't change the ratio in the TITANX wrapped Ethereum pool. So it doesn't actually impact the price. If anything, it locks more TITANX up in that liquidity pool, which is smart contract owned, which is not in the hands of another person. So this is why this build on TITANX idea is so big, because if anything has a TITANX liquidity pair, as people buy and sell that thing, it does not impact the TITANX wrapped Ethereum price. If anything, it increases it because it takes more supply off of market into those liquidity pools, and maybe there's some burning mechanics that happen there, which makes TITANX more scarce. It's not on the DEX, which means the buy and burn has more impact. So this is big, big idea to get. When things trade between each other, but not in the wrapped Ethereum pair, it does not impact price.
Right. And I understand that concept. Okay, well, appreciate that explanation. And the second one I want to talk about too, speaking of going between the two liquidity pools. So actually, I'm going to save that question for later. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds just yet. We'll save the juicy stuff for a little bit later. It's okay. Thank you for those questions just off the cuff there, especially on the liquidity pool front. So I guess we clarify, okay, the decision for ETH was made basically to ultimately be the better currency to use for TITANX, to, especially if it's going to go multi-chain, and to ultimately bring more value into the ecosystem and ultimately burn more TITANX. So that one makes perfect sense, I think. And I actually do like the idea of ETH being used as well. I think it's very, very powerful tool to use. Another question, and I think we've talked about this, but just for flat out clarification. So what is the actual point of Hyper as its function for TITANX, and how is it optimally utilized by the users? Just to flat out clear the air on both of those fronts.
Exactly, compounding. So you use your Ethereum to start hyper miners, and then once you get your hyper, you sell it for either TITANX and increase your TITANX position that way. Because by going into a hyper miner and then selling into TITANX, you can get a bigger position than if you just buy TITANX on market. Now the other thing is, you sell back into Ethereum, you start a next hyper miner. Now then the question becomes, if people constantly sell back into Ethereum, it does hurt the TITANX price, but in the process of the Ethereum buying TITANX, it burns 20%, and it gets locked up in a smart contract until it's used in the buy and burn. So on TITANX.win, in the stats, you can see Hyper has already has 2.1 billion TITANX locked in the buy and burn, and has burned 800 billion TITANX in 4 days. And it hasn't even used most of its buy and burn, maybe like 10% of it.
Right, and that's actually interesting to think about too, because I had forgotten that 20% gets placed in a smart contract, which is then later utilized for it goes to the vortex for that 20%, correct?
No, the 20% gets burned. So the
20% gets burned. Okay, right.
Ethereum buys TITANX. So let's say it uses one Ethereum, buys 100 billion TITANX for easy math. 10% of that goes into the vortex. 20% of that gets burned, and 70% of that buys hyper, and then 80% of that hyper gets burned. 20% gets put into the staking payouts. So 20% of all the TITANX bought with the Ethereum gets burned.
Right.
Which means that as people compound, they remove the TITANX supply off of market and burn it forever.
Right. Okay. That was actually good, because one of the things I had, I guess one of the questions I had was about this looping that's going on. And there's, I guess with the 20, if you take the 20%, that does change it a little bit. The one thing I'm curious about, a little bit is more than a little bit. Yeah, it's a lot. But when it comes to the TITANX supply, if you are having a event where basically 80% of the economic energy that's between or in TITANX that's going between the two pools is kind of just bouncing back and forth. I mean, it's obviously going to be reducing each time a little bit, or I mean, basically, yeah, it's going to be bouncing back and forth because you're pulling TITANX from this pool, bringing it to that pool, then it's going back to this pool, then it's going back to that pool. Is there a point in time, or is there something like, is the TITANX buy and burn contract going to, like, from TITANX itself, not Hyper, likely to be switched back on at a time where it's important for the ecosystem, so that way more of that TITANX gets actually burned? Is there a specific reason why looping is the main function right now?
Yeah, because this is only the Hyper buy and burn. The TITANX buy and burn and the Hyper buy and burn are two separate systems. The TITANX buy and burn is still buying on market and burning 100% of it. So that buy and burn happens in the background, which is even sicker because temporarily the price might go lower as people sell TITANX into Ethereum to go into hyperminers. The buy and burn in that time buys more off of market. The Hyper Ethereum also buys more TITANX off of market, so that when eventually all the supply is out of the hands of users into smart contracts, there's almost nobody selling. The buy and burn pushes up the price, and then Hyper, the buy and burn from TITANX has burned so much of the supply, there's almost no one on market to buy. And the Hyper, because the price goes up 3x, has that much more dollar value because the TITANX goes up 3x to buy Hyper, which then kickstarts the flywheel again because the dollar value to buy Hyper is way higher. So this is advanced flywheel mechanics. But it's epic. And I would actually love if the TITANX price would just dump it to as close to zero as possible. Couple buy and burn triggers that buys it all up. It's out of the hands of the weak hands. Smart contract has burned it. And then it's just basically up only. So if people want to dump, go ahead. There's $40 million of Ethereum ready to buy it. So there's no issue at all.
I think that is really important to understand too, just how significant the buy pressure could be. You know, if everyone just decides, or not everyone, but as you say, the weak hands or whoever classifies as, I guess, that frame sells out and the price nukes to 0.1 above zero. You know, you've got 15 million here. You've got 17 million here. You have, if I go to Hyper, you have, I think it's like almost 6 million over there. So you've basically got like $40 million sitting there in ETH buy pressure that could maybe do something about a price dip. I don't know. You tell me. And what's really interesting, because I was actually talking with some people last night about this, is that the way that price can move when you have $40 million in buy pressure on V3 and the liquidity is not necessarily staying directly underneath the price, is you could have the price move in ways that people aren't necessarily when I say people, I include myself in this, just mathematically speaking, that you can't really comprehend until it happens. Because as you go away from liquidity and you're using the same amount of economic energy to buy, I mean, the price moves exponentially quicker. So you got to understand that with that amount of economic energy, there is so much that can be done within this ecosystem. That's the one reason why whenever I see these headlines like is TITANX collapsing, and I think that, we were talking about this off stream. There was one yesterday talking about is TITANX collapsing, and that thought alone kind of makes me laugh. But yeah, if like Revo said, dump the price of TITANX. And I'm not telling anyone to do anything here. I don't think you should dump your TITANX, but if you're going to, I mean, we're not going to have a bad time at the end of the day, I don't believe. And I think that's really important to understand.
Yeah. I mean, the crazy thing is also, like, a lot of people are focused on the miner ROI on TITANX being negative, but this is by design. Because if you want a fair launch store of value, the only way to do it is to give people predictable cost bases and not do it in a way where you raise money from the general public. Mining is the only way to do it. Now, people are extremely irrational. They sold Bitcoin at $1. They sold Bitcoin at 10 cents. So people are irrational. People do what people do. Now, if miner ROI is negative on TITANX, that means no future supply is getting created, which means we're already in a situation where we have an expected supply of TITANX, and it's already deflating because there's no supply being created. So the deflation has started. And TITANX is officially the store of value now. So anything that builds on top of TITANX, as TITANX gains value, the supply comes out, it gets used in protocols, it gets burned. The amount of supply you might actually have after it's all said and done, we might only have like 20 trillion or whatever. And then we have all these protocols building on top of it and hyper, so you can imagine. It's pretty sick. And all these protocols burn. So even if it's a cap supply and no more supply ever gets created, we just have a hyper deflationary thing that drags everything up with it, which kickstarts all the flywheels.
It could be, I mean, very well is likely to be a beautiful sight to see. Maybe in the next like 6 to 12 months. I have no idea. That timeline could be so off. I have no idea. But yeah, we'll just wait and see on that front. So I appreciate those answers there. Another one that I wanted to ask is just to clarify, how is hyper staking different from TITANX staking? Because I know they're not the same. So how can what clarity can we bring around the two staking systems?
So staking in hyper is way less central to the design than TITANX. So in TITANX, a percentage of the Ethereum used to start miners gets given to the staking payouts, which is primarily owned by DragonX now, so it's protocol owned. Then on hyper, Ethereum buys TITANX, TITANX buys hyper, and then gets 20% of that hyper that was just bought to stakers. So you get staking payouts based on bought off of market supply, not inflationary supply, which is good for game theory. And you get the double buy effect. So staking is basically, it's more event-based on hyper, where there's going to be an arbitrage opportunity very likely between all the cycles, where you might be able to just buy 100 billion hyper on market, stake it, get 120 billion back. So it's more like an events kind of based thing. So we'll see how that plays out. It's definitely not central to the design of hyper, but we wanted to keep that staking element in it because I know people like it. Like for example,
everyone likes the carrot on a stick, right? You got to have one carrot on a stick somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So because some people just like doing max miners and then just staking it to the bull on top and then just whatever claiming the stake whenever they think the bull on top is and then selling it, which is totally fine. So we wanted to have that staking element in there because it protects you against yourself. So you can get your supply, lock it up until whatever you think the bull on top is, and you only have it at that point, so you don't early sell out. So it's more event-based rather than a central focus of the ecosystem in hyper.
Right. And I can appreciate that. Why did you change the obviously, it's not central, so you don't want the focus to be there as much maybe, but there's only a 98-day and a 369-day payout. Why were those days chosen?
Because after day 88, there's probably going to be a dip, and you want to give people something to look at after day 88, which is the vortex. The staking payouts is a lot to keep it sticky in the ecosystem after we finish the first max miner cycle.
Right. That actually makes a lot of sense. Placing a carrot after something placing a potential reward after something where, it could be seen as a net negative event or a net negative day per se. I like that idea a lot. So that's actually very easy to understand and cool. I don't think I have any questions on the staking front anymore for that. The other one I have is about the buy and burn. I've been seeing this a lot, and I think it'd be great for the community to just get clarity on that front. So the one thing I noticed, and I think I've seen a lot of these comments as well, is that at certain price points, depending on where we are in the liquidity, the hyper buy and burn to trigger buy and burn to use TITANX sometimes will say that the price slippage is price slippage is too high. Please wait for more liquidity to be added. So can you explain, why that happens and maybe what can be done about it, whether it's community or whatever?
So price slippage is basically, so the trigger on hyper currently is 8.8 billion TITANX. So if you go to Uniswap, you put TITANX on top, hyper at the bottom, you can actually see the price slippage. So you put in 8.8 billion. If the price slippage is above 5%, it will not trigger because that creates an MEV event, which you don't want. So you need to wait for users to sell, so there's actually supply to buy. Otherwise, it just slips, and there's no liquidity there, and it just comes back down. It's not a good thing. So it needs supply to buy. For there to be supply to buy, people need to sell or provide single-side liquidity above price with their hyper, and then just have the buy and burn buy them out. which is great strategy because you make more money, it keeps the protocol safer. So the price slippage there is as protection against MEV. Now, the other thing is, when it comes to the buy and burn, so I've seen a lot of it. The buy and burn on TITANX was turned down to 3.33 Ethereum every 280 minutes. Now, if you do the math, that means the buy and burn lasts until day 365 in TITANX. Because you don't want a scenario where the buy and burn runs dry. So this runs in the background. Hyper is now the primary buy and burn for TITANX. It's way more aggressive, way faster of a system. So the overall buy pressure is actually up at 2x. So people look at only the buy and burn on TITANX and like, oh, 3.33 on like every 280 minutes. Yeah, but now we have 6.6 Ethereum on top of that per hour. So overall, it's almost like a 2 to 3x higher. But people only see one thing and they think one-dimensional, and then they have their period and they freak out. If you do the simple math, the buy volume has gone up at 2x because Hyper is now carrying the burden of the buy and burn.
Right. Well, and I mean, if you just do the quick math, 280 minutes versus, so basically you have 10x the Ethereum being used versus the TITANX buy and burn. So I mean, it's 6.6 ETH, like you're saying. That's basically, what is that? Like 20 something grand, I guess.
Yeah,
20 some odd grand. Yeah, 26 grand every hour, plus at the 280 minute mark. So every 5 hours, I believe that is, if I'm doing the math right, or just shy of 5 hours, something like that. You are going to get an additional 13, 14 grand coming in. So like that does make a lot of sense, you know. And in terms of the slippage, I mean, yeah, that I don't think that's going to happen anymore. I mean, we can pull up the liquidity here for Hyper and really talk about.
The liquidity is sick for people that understand liquidity.
Let's bring it up because it's really interesting. And it just changed again. Interesting. Okay, well, that's the one thing I love about looking at these things, which I'm going to pull up in just a second, is that there's always something interesting going on under the surface. So just to clarify for those of you who are looking at my screen and be like, what are we looking at here? Well, this is all of the tokens on both the Hyper and TITANX liquidity pool that is able to allow you and I to buy or sell. If we look to the left here, this is the Hyper price increasing relative to TITANX. And if you look to the right here past this little red line, you are going to see the Hyper price decreasing relative to TITANX. And so that's the left and right, or the X and Y or the X-axis. And the Y-axis, or the vertical axis, you have the amount of tokens that are at each specific price tick. Okay, so why is this important that this liquidity is set up like this, Jake?
Yeah. So if you go to DEX screener, you can actually see how the liquidity is split up. So the total liquidity on Hyper is currently $315,000. Now, here's the thing. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see how much of it is TITANX and how much of it is Hyper. So as you can see, there's only $56,000 worth of Hyper, but there's $260,000 worth of buy orders.
Right.
That is exactly what you want to see. This is the best form of liquidity you can get.
Can you explain why?
Protocols. Yes. So this means that when people want to buy Hyper, example, the buy and burn, there's not much up for buy, which means the price slippage is high, which means it pushes up the price. Because people see liquidity pools and they're like, oh, there's $500,000 of liquidity in there. But then they look and it's like $450,000 of the shitcoin ready to be sold on market with single-side liquidity above price. So price cannot move up. People have to buy to $500,000. And then if people sell, there's only $50,000 in the actual sell back in the entire protocol. So you don't have $500,000 of liquidity. You have $50,000 of actual Ethereum back in it. So this is what a lot of scammers do to fool their community into thinking they add a lot of liquidity. What they did is they added $1 million or $500,000 of their token to the liquidity, which promises you that the price never goes up. They're going to sell $500,000 on your head, and they're not actually adding the back asset, which is either Ethereum, Pulse Chain, Binance Smart Chain, BNB, whatever the actual value of the chain is, which on Ethereum is Ethereum. You want to always look at the sell the sells, the buy side is what it's called, which is the TITANX in the pool in this example. That has the actual value because it's backed by Ethereum. So if the TITANX is higher than the hyper, that is sick. That's exactly what you want to see. Because it could be higher. Somebody could just add in $1 million worth of hyper, and it would look like you had $1.2 million of liquidity, but you only actually had 200,000. So
Right.
this ecosystem is sick.
It is pretty cool. I will definitely give you that one. It's really cool to see the breakdown, because that's the one thing about Uniswap is it doesn't really tell you, the total. I guess it does. It says 0.73 billion and 0.55 trillion there. But there was another question that I wanted to get. So, okay, one, thank you for that explanation. And two, there was where is it here? Let's see. So there was a question here that I think I can transition to. So I'm only bringing this up, guys. I'm not going to be going into everyone's questions just yet. I'm bringing this up because it's relevant to, oh, sorry, this is actually the wrong one. Where'd it go? Here we go. From Hugo, how much can expect these buy and burn amounts and intervals to stay the same, or will they be changing often? The reason I'm bringing this question up is because I had a question for you about that as well. And where is it here? I guess with the buy and burn. So I wanted to ask you, there's been days where the buy and burn has been like quite inconsistent, and it has changed upwards of 2 to 3 times in a single day. And there obviously, I can understand why there's no communication in terms of, on social media as to why that may be happening. But why is it that it has days or maybe few days where it's constantly changing and not really and not consistent?
Yep. So in the beginning of TITANX, it was very inconsistent because it was constantly rebasing on the refill value. So, for example, if you had 100 Ethereum being used to buy and burn, and on TITANX, like 150 Ethereum comes in to start miners, you refill at 100 Ethereum a day, which means the buy and burn never runs empty. So it would run at that rate because it gets refilled and doesn't run empty. Now, because the miner ROI is negative, there's no more Ethereum coming into TITANX, which is beneficial because it has a cap supply and a bunch of projects building on top of it, like Hyper. So now you want to preserve it. Because if you leave the buy and burn interval up to the community, you get a tragedy of the commons. Because everything would optimize towards short-term time frames, because everybody has short-term time frames in crypto, which would mean that... Wait, are we still here? I'm not sure if it's online. Let me check. Wait, can somebody say in the comments, is it me or cryptographics falling off? Okay, so I'm good. It's graphics. Hey, I guess we're hijacking the stream. Okay.
I'm rugged.
Rug.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I'm sure you don't have to repeat the whole answer for me unless you didn't answer and you waited. But I'm sorry. It's funny. They really try to get my internet figured out, and that's why I hadn't been streaming a lot. And yet I thought I got it figured out, and here we are. So I apologize, everyone, about that. Just can't.
All good. So we were talking about the buy and burn intervals. So
Yeah.
the buy and burn intervals on Titan, in the beginning, they were rebasing based on the refill rate, so that the buy and burn would never run out. Because there's a big psychological effect to having a bunch of Ethereum in a buy and burn, backing up the price. Now, since miner ROI is negative, it's beneficial because all the supply is capped. We have a bunch of projects building. There's buy pressure coming from somewhere else. So what we want to do now is we want to preserve it so that all of the supply that comes out, there's always a buyer there until it's all capped. And then it's basically just a cap supply coin with a cap on a project built on top of it. That gains a value through that. So now it's about preservation because the refill rate is 0. So it can't go high because it wouldn't get refilled. And then if the buy and burn runs out, people would run for the doors. So it's kind of like this balancing act. So in the beginning, it was rebasing based on refill rate. But now since it's not refilling, you want to make it last as long as possible for the remainder of the supply coming out. And then once all the supply is out, there's no more miners being created, that means TITANX is just a hyperdeflationary asset that backs everything else in the ecosystem. And obviously we have V1 and Hyper and DragonX. Those are all Ethereum buy and burns for TITANX. So all the buy pressure, utility, and narratives will come from other stuff rather than the buy and burn in the future. So now it just needs to last until the last supply comes out.
Right. Okay. So if I heard you correctly, like the changing is basically to adapt to make sure that the war chest essentially survives. Yeah, the buy and burn doesn't run out essentially. One question I would have on that front then is, I've seen a lot of people even questioning if the TITANX buy and burn is decentralized, why is it moving around so much? So this is the second one. So you're saying V2 is not decentralized?
No, I mean the V2 calling is decentralized, but there is a management key to set the interval to make sure it lasts.
Right.
The smart contract itself is decentralized because there's no way to access the Ethereum. There's no migrate function. There's no flush function. The only thing the Ethereum can ever do is be used to buy and burn. There's no way anybody can run with the Ethereum because it's locked in a smart contract with no owners or admin keys to access the Ethereum. So the only thing that can change is the interval.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, that makes more sense. I wonder why the reason, because I know there was a sentiment that at one point, I can't recall exactly why, but that V2 was going to be decentralized. And I'm not sure exactly what the wording was around that, but I guess the point of even bringing this up is more for clarity, and trying to understand where either I misheard or others misheard in terms of hearing that V2 will be decentralized, but maybe there was a more in front of decentralized and not just it will be
There's
decentralized.
definitely more decentralized than V1, that's for sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm not arguing that case.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So maybe it was that, but another thing that we said in the beginning was it is absolutely going to get announced at some point in the future, which is not now because we're still in the infancy state of the protocol where it needs to change to be able to last until all the supply is out. But the goal is to announce everything. So it's management keys until there is no longer any management needed, and then like it's game theory optimal settings, and then you just let it run.
Well, that actually beats me to the punch of a question I was going to ask, was this whole renouncing thing. So, I mean, it sounds like, if I heard you correctly, that you are planning on, or the keys are going to be renounced at some point when, supply is out, there's nothing more coming in. The protocol can be essentially just a sailing ship on its own accord. The winds are going in the right direction, and it doesn't need to be a corrected course. But correct. Do you have a vision in your mind, either in terms of maybe how you see things going? And obviously this is not a financial statement of the future, but maybe let's say a vision of, the scenario that could allow the keys to be renounced at a future date.
Nah, you just have to feel it, because this is how all the big protocols launch. You need to have some kind of management to make sure the protocol survives. And the only way to have management that survives for the long term is to have people manage it that are long-term minded. Because if you make it decentralized based on a DAO, people will put it extremely high for 3 to 7 days, it will run dry, and then the protocol will die and people will move elsewhere. So this is a tragedy of the commons. So the only and best option you have is to give it to someone or an entity that has long-term in mind and has all the incentives aligned to make it survive for the long term. So, like, for example, all the big protocols launched like this. Lido had a crap ton of admin keys for like 2 years, and then they renounced it. So there's a lot of, I'm not even sure if they renounced it at this point, but this is how a lot of big protocols launch. Admin keys, set it however it needs to survive. Once it's done, renounce, and then everything's chill. So this is how a lot of big things launch.
Totally. And I mean, like Bugux was saying, like, having a good actor or a benevolent whale that can do things is obviously, can be very, very, very important. So, and to this point, I think there's been, go ahead.
If you look at the Genesis have been doing a lot of cool shit.
Let's actually go there, because I've got some questions for you too. So I'm curious. Let me bring up, I'll go to Etherscan, and let's go to Genesis.
So, for example, on Hyper, Genesis seems to have provided liquidity. Now, the interesting thing is what it did with liquidity. So, Hyper dropped into the liquidity that Genesis set for a bit, Genesis seems to have pooled liquidity, burned the hyper, and reset TITANX liquidity below the market price. So it seems to me that any hyper it gets from liquidity, it burns and sends to the dead adders. And it's providing a bunch of TITANX liquidity below market to keep the miner ROI high. So whatever Genesis, whatever or what entity Genesis is, seems to be a pretty benevolent actor.
That's interesting. I hadn't seen that. So just to repeat that back to you, the price is moving into the Genesis position, and I think I saw that they provided, was it 200 billion, just over 200 billion in liquidity, I think.
There seem to be a bunch of positions.
Bunch of positions. Okay, I'd have to go and look to see exactly how many there are, but let's see. Okay, I see 1, 2, 3. No, that's ERC1. Okay, I have to go and look. But last I'd seen there was 200 billion deposits into that liquidity pool. But that aside, maybe there's more. So if I'm hearing you right, it moves into the position and then it pulls the position, burns the hyper, puts the position back in. Is that what it's been doing?
Yep, and it constantly goes into the position, exits the position, because the buy and burn is also a form of liquidity. So it constantly pushes it in and out of the position. So Genesis seems to be the biggest liquidity provider on hyper. And all the fees it gets and all the hyper it gets from liquidity providing, it just sends to the dead adders.
Interesting. That's actually really cool. I had not seen that yet. I have been paying attention to Genesis, but I did not catch that one over the last few days. So that is actually quite interesting. Damn. Okay.
Yep.
Well,
now, looking at Genesis itself won't give you the answers. What will give you the answers is Genesis seems to have a separate wallet, where it interacts with protocols, because you don't want Genesis to get hacked. So it interacts with protocols using a different wallet. And that wallet seems to be doing all the cool stuff. For example, that wallet also seems to have bought DragonX, and is probably planning to never sell it. There's also a burn wallet for ecosystem projects.
Right. Oh, actually, okay, then yet again, you beat me to the punch. I was going to ask you about that wallet buying DragonX using TITANX and not minting, because I know there's a lot of people. Actually, I've heard from a number of people that like they see that, and well, they're not exactly happy to see that Genesis went and took TITANX and bought DragonX with it. So I want to hear from you, like was the, I guess, trying to remember back to Genesis talking, or to hearing about what Genesis was going to be doing. And I don't remember, or I think I do remember, correct me if I'm wrong here, with one of the things to Genesis being that it will never sell TITANX. But yeah, we have in this, and I can bring up the transaction. I'll bring up the transaction for everyone to see here.
Yep. So the DragonX thing, what Genesis did, it sent 2 trillion TITANX in total to the DragonX vault. So it didn't mint any DragonX, so it didn't create supply. It just sent it to the vault. Now, what the vault did is it took the TITANX, staked it, and 92% of that Ethereum that it gets from staking awards is buy and burn V3 for TITANX. So it took dormant supply that it's never going to sell anyway, and it turned it into a perpetual buyer in the future. Like, for example, if you look on, I think it's TITANX.watch/DragonX, on day 369, DragonX gets $4.2 million of Ethereum, which also just so happens to be when all the last supply is in existence. So DragonX alone will probably provide $8 to $9 million of buy pressure to TITANX after all the supply is in existence and caps. So it turned a little bit of TITANX into a perpetual buyer forever in the future. Now, that's only 2 trillion. The other remaining 6.7 trillion that went in DragonX was user.
Right. So I understand that part. So it sent in DragonX to the smart or the vault essentially for DragonX, but
TITANX.
It does. I don't think I'm understanding the DragonX to TITANX swap. So it swapped. Yep.
That's on something separate. So that was a DragonX vault. This is what it looks like is it uses TITANX to buy DragonX, reducing its supply. So what it did it at a very interesting point. So if you look at, this is going to be extremely hard to find and put the timestamp together, but in that period of time, I bought a little bit of DragonX, which is probably never selling. I don't see Genesis ever selling anything to hurt the price in a way that hurts the price, like wrapped Ethereum pool, etc., etc. And it took that supply off the market, make DragonX more scarce. It seems to have, at that point in time, pushed it a bunch above the mint ratio. So it only took like 80 billion TITANX and dragged an extra $350 billion TITANX into DragonX. So a small move created a big impact on the system. And I think Genesis likes those type of things.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, I don't really know if I have any questions on that front at the moment. I think I'm still trying to figure out, how I feel about any TITANX getting moved at all. But at the same time, I see that Benevolent's there, so I'm gonna leave that one on
Okay,
where
I'll
that
give you
one
an
lies.
example. So,
But
what Richard Hart did back in the day, he had Hedron launch. So, what Richard Hart did, he had a bunch of hacks. Well, Richard Hart, what the OA, the entity
yeah,
OA, which we don't know whoever owns it or what entity, seems to have supported Hedron at the start because it forced a bunch of people to buy Hex on market and max take it to play the Hedron protocol. So Hex seems to have played around with the liquidity pools to make Hedron more valuable, which then dragged a bunch of buy pressure into Hex to max take it, which at the end, with the small move it made, had a bunch of ripple effects throughout the ecosystem that made it more valuable.
right,
So that was an example of Hex Hedron back in the day. And it's very similar stuff.
right. Yeah, I can actually see what you're talking about there. Yeah, I appreciate that clarification because that was a big deal when the OA did that. I vividly remember that because I was deep in that ecosystem
Yep.
when all that was going on. So that's a good point. Okay, I can appreciate that. The other main question I have about Genesis, and I'm sure there's a completely logical answer to this, but I haven't been able to find it. So if we go to, I'm going to bring up a link here, and if we go to Etherscan and we go to advanced searching under any wallet. So what this is, I just picked a random wallet under the holders just to be able to show this. So if you go to the method under what people can do in this in a wallet, someone that's really just focused on TITANX, you see there's batch mint, there's allowance, there's all these different calls, right? And then there's also claim, which is up here as well somewhere.
Are you
Claim is
talking about all the claim mint transactions?
yes. So what I wanted to ask you about
Yep.
specifically was with Genesis, why, if you go to the method, you can only see claim and batch claim, and you cannot see mint or
Because it's not minting. So the
right,
way Genesis works, it gets 8% of the supply created. And that happens during the claim mint function. So all these claim mints you see is not the Genesis interacting. It's users calling the claim mint function, and a percentage of that goes to Genesis. So it's
gotcha.
included. It looks like a Genesis transaction, but it's actually a user transaction. And you can see it if you go into the transactions.
Gotcha. So if we go in the transaction hash here, it'll actually show the other wallet interacting with. So
Exactly.
yeah. So from I see.
Here you can see 4.8 billion is what the user claimed, and 388 million went to Genesis, which is 8% of supply minted.
Right. So it's an addition. It's not like it's taking 8% from this person. It's an 8% additional of the amount that was minted, and it's sent to Genesis.
Yep. Now, let's go into some game theory. Why would you want anything like this? The answer is if all of the build on TITANX projects use a TITANX liquidity pool, Genesis can make moves that don't impact the price but benefit all the protocols by moving its TITANX around, providing single-side liquidity to protect the price from dropping on any ecosystem projects. It can buy a bunch of supply from ecosystem projects without hurting the TITANX wrapped Ethereum price, and essentially send it to a burn wallet like it's doing with Hyper. So with the TITANX that the Genesis gets, it allows it to do extremely benevolent things to the ecosystem.
Right. Right. And I mean, for one, you're looking at Hyper, be able to provide liquidity underneath the price and support there. So, and I mean, that alone is huge. And then to find out that it's providing liquidity, letting the price come into its zone, then pulling the liquidity, burning the Hyper, putting liquidity back under the price and supporting it on the way down. I mean, I didn't know that. That's actually really cool. So I can really appreciate that. And I can understand that. And I just honestly, I couldn't find it in the white paper anywhere. I looked
Correct.
multiple
We
times.
forgot to add it. So we added the 3% of Ethereum to Genesis, but the 8% of mints we didn't add at the start, and then we didn't add it later. But it was very openly discussed inside of the Telegram, and people could see it in transactions and stuff. So we might add it.
Gotcha. Okay, good. I'm glad I asked them because I was wondering. I'm like, wait, it's like I was just trying to figure out like why isn't this in the white paper? I remember there'd be something, but like it was just weird. So I appreciate that clarification a lot. Let me see here. What else do I have? Man, we're chewing through my questions so fast. I'm surprised. Let's see here. Oh, the burn pool. Okay, let's go talk about the burn pool for a second. I don't think we've I haven't heard really anyone talk about that yet. So let's go talk about the good old burn pool. What's happening with this thing, man? When's it going to turn on? I know there's obviously no ETH really flowing into the protocol, so it's kind of like a moot point and a little bit of on that front. But what is the scoop with the burn pool period, and your thoughts on it, and how it'll be, I guess, working in the future with kind of the environment we have right now for people participating in mining?
So the burn pool has a one-time enable function. The one-time enable function is once it's enabled, it can be disabled.
Right.
Now, after running a lot of game theory before launching TITANX, the 7%. So, for example, it says 62% going to buy and burn. It's actually 69%. Because the 7% that is supposed to go to burn pool, because it's not enabled, it gets redirected to the buy and burn. So the buy and burn has actually been 69%, which I think is way better for the ecosystem than 7% in the burn pool, because there's no actual burning projects. A lot of them are using TITANX to buy and burn because they notice it's a better use of economic energy to do it that way. Like, for example, Hyper, it uses TITANX to buy up Hyper, which reduces its supply, which increases miner ROI. That is actually a better use for a protocol like Hyper than just burning with TITANX, because then Hyper would have no value and it would stop the ecosystem. So since we haven't seen any projects actually use the burn pool, the 7% is better used for the buy and burn. And since now, so TITANX supply is basically capped, there's no extra future supply being minted, there's no point in enabling it. So maybe there is a point where it will be enabled in the future, but as of now, there's no real use for it, because even if it enables, there's no Ethereum going in until the miner ROI shoots up again, which is only 42%. Like, it's minus 42% on a max miner. So max miners are still in profit with all their T-rank bonuses, but it's minus 42% on a max miner. So the price only has to shoot up 42%, which when Hyper launched, TITANX did 109% in 20 hours.
Well, just clarification. If it's 50% down, it's got to go 100% up.
Correct. Yes.
Right. So
down, 100% up.
Yeah. So we basically got to be just shy of eating a zero on the TITANX price, and these miners will be in profit before T rank. I mean, obviously, if you're starting a miner now, you're not exactly going to get T rank. So you basically need to make sure that to be even breaking even, we need to do basically 2x from here puts you just a little bit into profit.
Exactly. So I would like to not see that. Now, I can't decide. The market decides. But if the TITANX price stay here, I'd be very happy. Buy and burns are working. Hyper is working. Hyper has become the mining compounding system. And TITANX is now officially the store of value.
I can see that. And I do understand with the buy-in or the burn pool too. Like, I was thinking of this last night when I was going through all these questions, and I was thinking to myself, like, yes, okay, well, the burn pool is an incentive and it's a thing you want and blah, blah, blah. But also, if there's no ETH, like, it's like getting premier access, to an empty store, for buying a ticket. It's like it's literally the most useless thing ever. So I think with kind of this crescendo that's happening here under the surface, because it's funny because you kind of have the external world and the view of the macro view of what's happening. It looks like, well, okay, TITANX price is dumping and supply is still coming out and we're not going anywhere. But under the surface, if you start looking at the data and what is happening with like supply, how Hyper is going to assist with these flywheels, or really get the flywheel going for TITANX, you kind of have this point in time coming inevitably where there won't be much holding down Titan at any point. And when the stars align and a specific entity, sees those stars and also aligns with those stars, well, maybe, there's, and I'm not saying that's the only reason we could do it, but as there's a few different ways to a supply constriction and a lack of selling, you have Genesis that could possibly do something. You have just market that could do something. You have just the irrationality of a bull market that could already be contributing to stuff. I mean, there is so much really going on within under the surface right now that's kind of coming to a crescendo here, very quietly, if you will.
Well, exactly. So once all the supply is out for TITANX, what do you have? You have a token that has a bunch of developers that will probably be multi-chain, has all the buy pressure from multi-chain going into it, has a capped supply, only gets burned, it needs to be used for projects. So then you just literally have a hyper-deflationary store of value token that was fair launched with a big community. That's a pretty good recipe. So I'm not worried at all about Titan. I think it's in the perfect position.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think it's in a very, very, very good position. Just patience, time, keep calm, and mind hyper on, as the t-shirt should say. We need some of those. But I was going to ask you, I've got about 20 or so minutes left, and I didn't ask you before the stream about your time and how much you've got. But if you're good for time still,
yeah,
I wanted to first.
Hours.
What's that?
I can go for 12 hours.
Okay, awesome. Right on. That's perfect. So the first question I wanted to ask you here is, with where did it go? You ever just have something in your brain and it's like perfectly, it's just sitting there all nice and perfect, and all of a sudden, boom, it's gone. That just happened to me, guys. So I'm gonna skip that one, wait for it to come back. Oh, sorry, there it is. So you keep talking about on Twitter, hyper is when you get it, it's like an like a wow moment. And I think there's a lot of people that really aren't, like, they get the surface. And I mean, I see a lot of comments. I've even received questions being like, well, what do you think is going to happen here with hyper? Because if people are constantly taking profits and people are, already in TITANX that made a lot of gains and they're going into hyper, how can this compounding be sustainable in the long term? The question is, what if we're looking at all these potential like negative scenarios, what's the secret sauce or the part of hyper that, despite all that, is still the part that you tweeted about, where like when you get it, and it doesn't get undermined by too much economic energy compounding?
Oh, the compounding is great. So, okay, let's take this scenario. People go into hyper with Ethereum. The Ethereum buys TITANX. 20% gets burned, 10% gets put into the vortex. The Ethereum also goes into the vortex, which buys TITANX in the future when the supply is capped. So the vortex there's a lot of game theory in the vortex and the timing of it. But the Ethereum buys TITANX. So it's essentially, if they're selling down TITANX to get Ethereum to go into hyper, it's taking TITANX out of their hands and giving it to a smart contract. It's extremely predictable, locks it off a market, uses it at a set interval, and burns 20% of it. So it goes from a lettuce hand user to a benevolent smart contract. So over time, as this happens, this is why I like saying I would love for all the TITANX supply to be owned by smart contracts. If these loops keep going on with other projects building, etc., we have some other stuffs in the work as well. You could have a scenario where whatever amount of supply is left after it's all said and done is just owned by smart contracts, and the liquid supply is almost nothing, and you have all this demand for TITANX to be used in all these other protocols. Then it could go pretty wild. Hypothetically, not financial advice, but all of these flywheels, when you run the numbers, only end up net beneficial to TITANX.
Right. Do you think, like, we're sitting on where's the liquidity for hyper? It's with just 257,000. I mean, it's concentrated. It's not just like linear, or I guess your standard like V2 style liquidity of 257K. With 257K in liquidity on the sell side with TITANX, do you think, going to create stability with this, or does the pool itself need to grow equally with the amount of economic energy that is built up through, let's say, compounding?
Sort of. So a part of the liquidity is the buy and burn, because the buy and burn buys, so it adds to the liquidity. Because when you buy, you add TITANX to the pool, you remove hyper, you burn it. So you have liquidity on the DEX, and then you have liquidity in the buy and burn, and then you have liquidity from traders getting in and out because they see, I don't know, some irregularity in the market. There's also still trading going on. So it scales by default, because the buy and burn is a form of liquidity. Because as people sell, it's hard to push down the price because there's so much single-side liquidity. And when it does enter the liquidity, the buy and burn just buys it back out of it. So the buy will always stays there.
That's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought about buy and burn being liquidity, but really you're bang on, because it's kind of secondary liquidity, if you will, or detached liquidity. There's probably a better, maybe a catchy word or phrase that could be utilized to coin that, but that's interesting, where you have all the liquidity that you need kind of sitting on the sidelines and just slowly being injected and dripped in, and not being there all at once. That's interesting to think about that concept. So I'm gonna need a day to like process that properly. But that's really cool. I'll give you that. That's really cool.
It is pretty cool. I mean, if you kind of think about it, like you have the real estate market. Are there a bunch of single site orders on real estate? No. There's no liquidity on a DEX for real estate, yet real estate sells all the time. So it's liquidity that is sitting in people's wallets until a good deal pops up, and then the liquidity injects into the market. The buy and burn is kind of like that. Where, yes, you have liquidity on a DEX, but then you also have liquidity either in people's wallets ready to buy at a good price, like, for example, TITANX, or you have a smart contract protocol that just buys in intervals. That's also just-in-time liquidity. So like a lot of the liquidity that people have in mind is not on the DEX. It's actually just out there in the ether waiting for the right time.
Right.
I don't remember where I heard that, but like comparing it to the real estate market was such a good idea, because there's no limit orders on houses. But when there's a good deal, people all of a sudden find liquidity. So it's kind of interesting.
Right. I'm gonna have to think about that one to fully wrap my head around it. But I can see what you're saying there. That's an interesting comparison. That's a very interesting comparison. What I want to make sure I get to before I got to head out in, let's say, 15 minutes or so, I want to start to ask your guys' questions on, but before I move on, did we hit, actually, one thing I want to ask is the compounding game. You know, I've been seeing people in the comments saying like mid to long, some people are saying shorter. Like, I know you are the founder and I don't want to ask you to tell people what to do with their money, but do you, in terms of, or just do you see a specific period that is at this point in time most effective, more so than another? Or do you have any commentary on, what compounding actually looks like time-wise?
Yes. So hypothetical, not financial advice, could move to zero. We're lucky if this works. Disclaimers. From design point of view, a good idea to compound could be you start short and then you go longer out. So you add plus 10 days to every compound. So let's say you do a 5-day miner, you claim that miner, you make some profit, you do whatever you want, you compound back, and then you go 15 days. Then you do it again, you go 25 days. You do it again, you go 35 days. So every compound, you go longer out. That is a very safe strategy. Because if you keep going short, at some point the market is going to move against you. But the longer out you go, the safer you are. So short in the beginning could be a really good idea, not financial advice. And then going into longer time periods as you compound going into the future.
Gotcha.
Mathematically, that makes a lot of sense.
Definitely. I mean, even for on one front, you're going to have, just as people compound the amount of economic energy required to hold up prices more, so you're likely to have to mine for longer in order to sustain ROI. Even if the liquidity pool can support price even moderately well, you're probably going to want to have a cushion there anyways, in case, whatever happens. So that makes perfect sense. I can understand that.
Yep.
So let's go into questions from you guys. I'm going to back up a little bit here. I am not, for one, streaming expert. Hyper is live, my man. Or my friend, I should say. I don't know who you are.
It's app.hyper.win.
Yep. You can even just go to TITANX, and then once the app opens up, you can just change TITANX to Hyper, and it's the same thing. So let's start with your guys' questions. For one, let's start with Revo here. How do you do all the mathematical modeling on all this? I think that's an interesting question. I don't think I've ever seen that one come up before.
It's a good question. It's just, I don't know. I guess we all just have autistic brains. So all I think about is systems. Like even when I'm sitting in a restaurant, I'm analyzing the systems of the kitchen and the service and how they can do it faster, or like their walking path to the table to save time, or like how to order in the fastest way, how to run the conversation. I've always been just a systems thinker. I think this comes from the software engineering background. So whatever I do, I always think about systems. So I think it's a natural thing, probably a little bit on the spectrum, but seems to have served very well. I'm like, I could be on the spectrum at relatively high emotional IQ. So maybe that, but also I just love Google Sheets. It's amazing.
Yeah, that Google Sheets goes take you miles alone. So I think that's cool.
Yeah.
when you're thinking about things all the time, you tend to have many, many, many epiphanies. When you're writing those thoughts down in Excel and you're combining that with constant obsessive thinking, I mean, you're probably going to come up with something pretty cool. So
Yes.
that makes perfect sense. So let's see here. What else do I have? You go. How sure are we that projects will actually launch and will require TITANX to work, and that those projects in themselves will have any user demand? I think DragonX and Helios are great examples.
Well, there's a bunch of stuff coming up. So we have one of them that I'm excited for is Titan Blaze. That one is sick game theory. Sick game theory. So Titan Blaze is awesome. I would love to see Hyperblaze, because that protocol could work wonders if it existed on Titan and Hyper. That could be sick. Then we also have Titan Farms, which is from the DragonX team. You have a bunch of other projects. If you go to titanxhub.com, you'll find a bunch. But one of the things I've noticed is this community seems to be very focused on tokenomics and innovating tokenomics. Like, so far, nothing has launched that has just been a copy of something else. I feel like innovation is coming out of our community, which is interesting. Because maybe this is a narcissistic point of view, but if you look at anything, usually, like for example, Alex Hormozy, he used to tell this story. Alex Hormozy is like a business dude, where he would run masterminds. And when he didn't have a mustache, the people that joined the mastermind didn't have a mustache. But then once he started growing a mustache and using it in advertising, people with mustaches started identifying with Alex Hormozy. Because I have a mustache, he has a mustache, we must be buddies, and he's smart. So then his mastermind started filling up with dudes with mustaches. So whoever is in front, doing the marketing, talking about the mathematics and the protocol and design, people like that are attracted to people that are like them. So I think because we're so on the cutting edge of using the building blocks and liquidity pools and understanding all these tokenomics, that we seem to attract builders that think in the same way. Because if you have a absolute loser of a founder, you'll have an absolute loser of a community. So I think the initial injection of DNA into the community is big, because now we have guys like Mike Dean, we have Ted, we have a bunch of dudes, we have you, like that are actually talking about it. We're all obsessed with tokenomics, like math and design and all of these things. I think that is just unique to certain communities where they're attracted to certain ideas. Like in the Richard Hardy ecosystem, it's like obsessing over conspiracy theories about the sack wallet, which I'm not a part of. I don't like that part of it, but some people do. So every community attracts a different type of person based on the initial DNA injected in the community, because people look for people that are like them.
Yeah, I think, just even going into the side of the equation where, this is a new idea. These are new building blocks that people are getting to work with for the first time. You're just going to have ideas like if we look at the renditions of the wheel, first people are just on horses, right? And people are probably coming up with all sorts of saddles and all sorts of technologies to make their horse better, right? Maybe trying to take care of the horse better, maybe feed the horse better food, and really prime this horse to be top performing. But then as soon as someone came up with the wheel, right, then the ideas that came from that exploded. Like look where we are today with what we're able to do with the wheel. The first wheel was transportation, and eventually that idea of a rotating disc got translated into gears. It got translated into like CDs and DVDs and all sorts of like crazy technological advances that came from the idea of like a rotating disc and using spinning wheel essentially. And so I think naturally when you come up with something new and different, you're going to naturally see other ideas remixing, this whole remix strategy, which is actually a big viral thing for like YouTubers and content creation, as well as remixing, taking something someone has already done, remixing it, and it goes usually and it can go viral. It's similar to that front. So I think for that alone, I think of course you're going to get a lot of people coming in and really building things no one's seen and not making duplicates necessarily. Like even TITANX to Hyper, they are very similar on the surface, but they're so different under the hood, like completely different, and they're and the purposes they serve as well. So, I mean, I would agree with you on that front for sure.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to see, because even the Titan Farms, it's a genius game theory. It's not just a copy or a fork of something. Like, it's pretty sick. So I think we're going to see some beautiful things being built in the community.
I think so. I think so too. I think this is I mean, it's cool because this is just the beginning, and like, you know, when who knows what's going to happen come down the line, especially actually there's two questions. Marco, I'm getting to this in a second. Don't you worry. But there was another question that I saw that was to do with the multi-chain aspect of Hyper. And I would love to hear a little more about this idea of Hyper being multi-chain before we go and talk about possibly Titan Farms.
So the Titan Farms thing, I'll leave that up to Eric and the DragonX team to talk about, because I'm not sure what they want out of respect.
Yep.
Once they give all the information, I'm happily giving my perspective on it. So with Hyper multi-chain, the idea is to launch Hyper multi-chain on the highest volume chains. Highest volume means the highest volume of altcoin trading, excluding stablecoin volume and wrapped Ethereum volume, because that shows actual altcoin activity on a chain.
Say that one more time. Sorry. If
to look at volume on a chain for altcoin activity, you have to exclude stablecoin trading and wrapped Ethereum trading, because you can have a chain that has $1 billion in volume, but it's just 995 million of Tether moving around, because people use the chain to send stablecoins because it's cheaper.
Right.
So we need high altcoin trading volume chains, and then we would get a wrapped TITANX on that chain, and then everything would route through a wrapped TITANX, and that wrapped TITANX is wrapped TITANX from Ethereum. So the supply creation of TITANX only happens on Ethereum, so there's no inflation, and then TITANX would essentially go multi-chain and have multiple protocols launched on whatever chain is most applicable to it, and all uses TITANX that was originated from Ethereum. Now, what chains and stuff we're still looking at, but it is definitely an idea.
Right. Is I guess I don't want to ask that question. I was going to say, is Pulse Chain on the radar for that? I would assume, you know, obviously it's on the table for sure, but is Pulse Chain one of the, like, if you had a, actually, if you can answer this, sure, great. But if you can't, no problem. Do you have like a top 1 or 2 or 3 chains that you're really speculating on that are candidates at this point?
I mean, you can look at that deck screen and volume. Like if you look to the left side of deck screen, you can see the biggest volume chains.
Right.
Ethereum L2s are definitely on the list, like Arbitrum, for example. But we have to do the calculations on altcoin volume, excluding Ethereum and stablecoins.
Right.
So we'll have to see on that. The thing I like about Pulse Chain is there's a massive community overlap, where a lot of our community knows about Pulse Chain, and a lot of the Pulse Chain community knows about TITANX, but they don't participate because of the gas fees, because they're so used to Pulse Chain now.
Right.
So there is definitely a community overlap there. Even though it's one of the lower volume chains, the community overlap is massive. So there's definitely something there. But yeah, we'll have to see the rollout schedule basically on like what chain we're doing first. Because like for Pulse Chain, we need to modify the smart contracts a little bit, because to use PulseX for all the buying, burning and stuff. Arbitrum we can use Uniswap, so that's a lot easier.
Right. And I mean, things are going to evolve. Sorry.
And there also needs to be an easy bridge to bring wrapped TITANX over.
Right. Yeah, that's obviously pretty important. And I mean, like, one of the things too that could happen. I mean, like, we have this the list here of you know, all the different chains in terms of like highest to lowest in terms of what deck screener shows. And I mean, there could be a flippening of different chains all over the map in terms of where they sit now to where they are, you know, come bull market, and that could be sustained at some point too, and could dictate a change in where you want to go as well. So I think I think waiting and looking to see kind of how the landscape evolves is a smart thing, you know? Let me see. Okay. Let me just go to the best questions here. If you see any too, let me know, point out to the user, and I'll try and find them as well. If you can see the comments as well, but let's go to Marv here. So please circle back to the compounding logic. How is this system supposed to work out if people start taking compounded profits? 2 times 5x, or 2 times 5x, so 25x profits. Would Hyper drain the ETH from the LP?
No, not at all. So the way liquidity pools work is liquidity pool is the protection against liquidity draining. So for example, if you have hypothetical scenario, the TITANX Hyper LP is $10,000. The TITANX wrapped Ethereum LP is $100,000. Even if people would send the Hyper LP to 0, they can only drain 10% of the TITANX LP. So the hyper LP always needs to be smaller than the TITANX LP to prevent that scenario from happening. The scenario could happen if when the hyper LP is way bigger than the TITANX LP, then yes, you could have a scenario like that. But if it's contained, then it's totally fine. Because even if it gets completely drained and dumped on TITANX, the liquidity pool is the protection.
Right. And if I could outline, just to clarify that, so what you're saying is, because the amount of liquidity in the hyper TITANX pool is significantly smaller than liquidity in the TITANX wrapped ETH pool, the amount of tokens that can be pulled from that pool, even if someone sells all their hyper and drains all the TITANX, it's so insignificant compared to the other pool that even if they dump it on the market completely, they cannot basically drain the pool of ETH. And yes, they'll dump it down probably like fairly significantly, like maybe 20, 30, 40, 50%, but or maybe more, who knows, right? I'm not going to do the math live here, but it's not going to take all of the wrapped ETH out of the pool and leave absolutely nothing in there. Is that correct in saying that?
Yep, correct. Yeah. So the Uniswap liquidity pools are epic. So genius.
They're really cool. The V3 was awesome. Let's see.
Crypto innovation, Uniswap is up there. It's probably number one innovation ever in crypto.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with that. Let's see what else we've got here. Let's see. We've got, let's see, here's a good question. Do you think ETH fees hinder adoption at the moment during the inflationary stages I'm assuming for hyper, you're saying?
Not at all. Because the thing is, the people that complain about Ethereum fees generally are smaller players. On Ethereum, you have a lot of whales and a lot of big players. Like if you're playing around with $100,000, you don't care about paying $200 in gas fees. So it's a different market. It's a completely different market. So Ethereum, another way to look at it, Ethereum did $2.35 billion of volume yesterday. Pulse Chain did, actually, let's use another example. Let's do Base, which is an Ethereum L2. Base did 150 million of volume. So Ethereum did 2.5 billion. Base did 150 million in volume. If you have 5% of Ethereum, you have $100 million of volume, I think, is the number.
Say that one more time, sorry.
If you get, so whatever, I'm looking at the size of the pie slice. So if you have 10%, 5% of the adoption on Ethereum,
right,
then it's, I think, $100 million in volume. Yeah, $100 million in volume. If you get 50% of Base, you still have less volume, even though you get a bunch of adoption. So yes, you pay more fees on Ethereum, but it's like going to the high-end mall. You can take your store and put it in a small mall in some small remote area, pay $500 in rent, but only make $3,000. Or you can go to a high-end mall, pay $10,000 a month in rent, but make $100,000. Overall, the profit is higher. So Ethereum is a high-end mall. We just have to deal with the gas fees because that's what all the money is. And then you'll have these subsections of other stuff on other chains. But Ethereum is the big daddy. I will always be, pretty much.
Right. And there's always people that are going to be willing to spend. Actually, I'll ask this. I got two more questions. One personal, one that I have, and then one just to clarify. So Marv asked this question, so please circle back to the compounding logic. Remember that question, obviously. And then he asks, in that case, the ROI for compounding is only paper gains.
No, because you clarify. Exactly. Yeah. It depends on what you realize, of course. But this is also the thing. Like, this is one of the things I saw on TITANX. So in TITANX, in the beginning, you had a bunch of sniper bots. So people saw 300x ROIs on the dashboard. And then by the time they got the reminder, it's only a 12x. And then people were complaining and complaining and complaining. I'm like, funny. Bro, you just made a 12x. What the fuck are you complaining about? Yeah. And it's like this, I don't know. Imagine your friend being like, hey, give me $1,000. I'll be next week, I'll be back with 12,000. You'll be like, what? That's a great deal. Like, I don't understand some of the thought process behind this stuff, but people get attached to a number that is unrealistic. And it all depends on what you realize at the time when you get your minds or how you play the game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is crazy. It's funny. I mean, like, if I hope no one had that experience with Hyper, because when Hyper first launched, the ROIs were pretty astronomical, and I really hope that that wasn't you in the beginning too, because I mean, myself and everyone else that were looking at everything was like, sure, I hope that happens, but we'll see about that. And of course, that didn't happen. So yeah, it's crazy that you can be unhappy with the 10x. I mean, I hope that's none of you guys, and I hope if it was you guys, only in crypto, man. So I got to go here in just a couple of minutes, but I wanted to ask. No, I'm not going to ask that because I can't remember what I was going to ask you. So I'm just going to leave that one alone, and instead I'm going to use Ollie O as a I don't know what I'm trying to say there, but basically, thank you, Olio, for this little reminder here. Can you remind everyone to call the Hyper buy and burn, or any buy and burn, period? And yeah, so if you are participating in Hyper, or you want to basically contribute to the ecosystem, then you can come to app.hyper.win, and you can come over here to the buy and burn section, and you can click trigger the buy and burn, which I don't know if it's gonna show my MetaMask.
It will ask you to add the MEV block or RPC first, and then it will give you the pop-up.
Yep. Yep.
And you obviously get incentivized for calling it. So when Gwei is like around 55, 60, it's actually profitable.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is, this is something a lot of people don't get. If you want to sell, it's a really good idea to trigger the buy and burn before you sell, because the buy and burn on average pushes up the price 5%. So if you're planning to sell 500, a 5% move is an extra 5%. Is an extra $250. So maybe you spend $60, you get $40 back. So you have $20 down, but you make $250 more because you pushed up the price before you sell. So like the buy and burn has a lot of like incentives attached to it, where everybody should call it all the time. Yeah, it's not just the incentive fee that is the incentive.
Totally. Slow and steady, if you're willing to do it, can really get you a lot further ahead in terms of ROI than just being like, one click, sell, I'm out. Especially relatively low liquidity, when you're coming to multi-$1,000 transactions. If you're doing something like that, do yourself a favor, do everybody a favor, and mainly do yourself a favor though. Don't play the virtuous one. Do it for yourself too, so that way you make your bags bigger. I mean, why wouldn't you want to do that? So let me see if there's any quick questions here.
I want to answer. So you have this Emilio guy. He says maximum miners are at 50% ROI and only halfway mined. So the ROI on TITANX is a very, very fair ROI. So what happens is, when you start same thing with Hyper, when you start a miner, you use Ethereum to start that mine. You don't use dollars. So for example, when TITANX launched, Ethereum was around $1,800. Now, by the time some people got their miners, Ethereum was at $3,600. So Ethereum moved up 100%. So we could calculate the ROI in two ways. One is you calculate it based on the dollar value going in, which is $1,800 at that time. Or you can calculate your ROI versus Ethereum, which I think is a way fairer metric, because it shows you actually, because you spend Ethereum, you didn't spend dollars. So that 50% ROI, let's say hypothetically, Emilio started his miner when Ethereum was $1,800. If he has a 50% ROI now, that actually means he made a 2x in dollar value, even though it's only 50% against Ethereum. So like that's something people have to keep in mind. Like we do very, very fair ROI calculations, like the hardcore crypto way, but comparing everything to the Ethereum price, not the dollar price. Because we could fabricate all these ROIs by doing it with dollars. Everybody would have their feel good, which we might still do. I mean, at the end of the day, the average IQ of the retailer coming in during a bull market won't understand this advanced stuff. But yeah, there's two different ROIs: ROI versus Ethereum and ROI versus dollars. And if Ethereum goes up, your ROI is actually way higher than dollars than you see on the dashboard.
Right, and I like that. It's fair launch, fair ROI. I like that. Fairness across the board in that sense. And I think that when you see it like that, it's like, 50% on top of what I would have made if I was holding Ethereum. That ain't bad. I'll take that any day of the week, especially because Ethereum ETH is currently sitting at just over 4K. Is it 4K still? I haven't looked this morning, but it's somewhere around 4K anyways.
Yeah, it's somewhere around 4K.
Yeah, so sweet. That's all I have at this point, not all I have. That's all the time I have for this today. Thank you, Jake, for being here and answering all the questions. I know I tried to ask you the hard ones, but it's just like water off a duck. You know, you kind of just we're too good at that. I gotta give you that. So thank you all who asked the questions. Thank you to all over 200 of you that came here today. Thank you, Mo, for the super chat. And I saw there was another member that joined as well today too. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Guys, if you want to mine Hyper, I have the links in the description below to go to the Hyper website. Jake, how can people... Oh, yeah, go for it if you got something.
So Ollie said, if TITANX stays low for a while, current community members don't have Ethereum, they won't sell for it, and won't sell for Ethereum. We therefore need new users to have Ethereum. Here's an interesting statistic. The launch of Hyper is bigger than the launch of TITANX in terms of dollars. So Hyper had bigger adoption at the start than TITANX. So Hyper is already off to a bigger start. So, which means we're attracting Ethereum from outside of the community as well. Because otherwise the TITANX price will be way lower than what it actually is.
That's
so true. Hyper is bringing new adoption and new Ethereum in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting. That's a really good point, actually, because the Hyper price or the TITANX price could have absolutely plummeted, and it went down, you know, but it did not plummet per se. So that's a good point. Thanks for your comments, Ollie. Appreciate those. Okay, sweet. I gotta run. I really do gotta run. Jake, where can people find you if they want to communicate with you in any way, shape, or form?
Twitter. NK knows is the best by far.
Gotcha. Sweet. So NK knows. I don't know if I have it in the description. I can link that after the stream here for anyone that wants to, you know, tweet Jake. But guys, Jake, thank you for being here. Thank you all in the chat for being here, and I hope you guys enjoyed the stream. If you did, make sure you share it out so everyone else can get clear on what Hyper is. We talked about a whole lot here, so make sure you've liked, make sure you're subscribed to, and have yourselves a great day. Jake, thank you again, man. And we will see you all again very soon. Peace, guys.